There is a type of man that the 20th century produced in some abundance and that the 21st century has largely stopped producing. A man who had actually done things before he arrived at whatever it was the world eventually decided he was for. Not the man who trained and prepared and studied and arrived at his destination through the deliberate accumulation of relevant experience. The other kind. The man who had simply lived, widely, physically, dangerously, in places that the maps of respectable biography did not always cover, and who arrived at his destination carrying the weight of all of it, visible in the body and the face, and the specific quality of authority that comes from a man who has stood in situations where the outcome was genuinely uncertain and has come through them, not unscathed, but upright. Victor McLaglen was that man. And Hollywood, which was very good at manufacturing the appearance of that kind of man, recognized immediately when it encountered the actual thing. Victor Andrew de Beer Everly McLaglen was born on December 10, 1886, in Tunbridge Wells, Kent, England, the son of a bishop, which is either an irony or a preparation, depending on how you read the life that followed. He was one of 8 brothers, most of whom were physically large, and most of whom found their way, by various routes, into the entertainment industry, because the McLaglen family produced a specific combination of size and charisma that the public found compelling and that the performing arts had uses for. Victor was the largest and the most compelling and the one who went furthest, though the distance between where he started and where he ended was not a straight line and was not traveled quickly. He left home at 14. This is the biographical fact from which everything else follows. The fact of a boy of 14, large for his age, and constitutionally unsuited to the patience that formal education required, who decided that the world was more interesting than the classroom, and who went to find out if he was right. He was right. The world he found was large and various and frequently dangerous, and he moved through it with the physical confidence of someone whose size had always provided a certain basic security and whose temperament had always inclined toward the action that the size made possible. He served in the British Army in the Second Boer War. He prospected for gold in Canada. He worked as a pearl diver. He was a circus performer, a strongman specifically, which is the kind of performance that requires genuine strength rather than the simulated variety, and that provides its own immediate feedback in the form of the thing either being lifted or not being lifted. He was a physical trainer aboard ocean liners. He farmed in Australia. He fought in a variety of contexts that ranged from the formally organized to the considerably less so. And he boxed. He boxed seriously, professionally, in the heavyweight division, at a time when the heavyweight division contained men of genuine capability, and when a professional record was not assembled from carefully curated opponents, but from whoever was available and willing. He fought Jack Johnson in 1909, the legendary heavyweight champion, the first black world heavyweight champion, a man whose physical abilities were extraordinary and whose significance in the history of the sport is permanent. The fight went 6 rounds. McLaglen did not win. He also did not go down, which against Jack Johnson was its own form of achievement, and which demonstrated that the large body contained qualities that went beyond mere size. He arrived in the film industry in the early 1920s through the British cinema, making a series of films in England before the American industry found him and understood what it had. He moved to Hollywood, and John Ford found him. And what Ford found was exactly what Ford always looked for. A man who was genuinely what he appeared to be, whose physicality was real rather than constructed, whose emotional expressiveness existed because the life behind it was real rather than because a technique had been applied to produce the appearance of reality. Ford cast him repeatedly across a career that spanned decades and that produced, in their collaborations, films of sustained quality and occasionally of genuine greatness. The Informer in 1935 was the greatness. Ford directing, McLaglen playing Gaipo Nolan, an Irish Republican Army informer who betrays a comrade for £20 during the Irish War of Independence, and who spends the night after the betrayal in a disintegrating psychological spiral of guilt and self-deception and desperation, with a complexity and a depth that nobody watching the large former boxer had prepared themselves to receive. The performance is not the performance of a man who has studied the role from the outside and constructed a representation of it. It is the performance of a man who has understood Gaipo Nolan from the inside, who has found in himself the specific combination of weakness and need and self-deception that the character requires, and who has played it with the complete commitment of someone who is not protecting himself from what the role reveals. Gaipo is not a hero. He is not a villain. He is a man who did a terrible thing for a small amount of money, and who cannot, in the hours that follow, find a way to live with what he has done. McLaglen played the inability to live with it, with a rawness and a heartbreak that the Academy recognized with the Best Actor award, beating Charles Laughton and Clark Gable and Franchot Tone and Paul Muni, which is to say, beating the best that the year had to offer. Off the set, he was a man of organized energy rather than dissipated energy, a distinction that matters and that the rough brawler image obscured. He was disciplined. He formed and led a group called the Light Horse Troop, a semi-military organization of stuntmen and riders that he organized with the methodical attention of a man who understood that large physical enterprises require structure to function. He rode. He maintained his physical conditioning with the seriousness of a former professional athlete who understands that the body is the instrument and that instruments require maintenance. He was convivial and generous in the way of large men who have nothing to prove about their size, not aggressive, not threatening, but capable of making rooms feel smaller simply by entering them. He appeared in How Green Was My Valley in 1941, in She Wore a Yellow Ribbon in 1949, in The Quiet Man in 1952, the Ford films that formed the spine of a career that also included films made for other directors, made in other genres, made with varying degrees of material to work with and varying degrees of success. He was always the most physically present person on screen. He was not always the most interesting person on screen, because the material did not always require it, and because the physical presence was sufficient for what many of the films needed. But when the material matched the instrument, when Ford gave him Gaipo Nolan and trusted him with the full weight of what Gaipo Nolan was, the result was something that the career had been building toward without either of them knowing it. He died on November 7th, 1959, in Newport Beach, California, at the age of 72. He had been acting until close to the end. The body that had gone 6 rounds with Jack Johnson in 1909 had lasted 50 more years of use, which is its own form of testimony to the quality of the original construction. He left behind the films and the record and the specific, unduplicable fact of a life that had been actually lived before it was performed. The pearl diver, the boxer, the gold prospector, the strongman, the soldier. And then, at the end of all of it, the man who stood in front of a camera and broke the audience's heart. He was always, under all the other things, that man. It just took a while for the world to find him.